everyone, and welcome to our deep dive into a question that's kind of haunted humanity, like, since forever.
Yeah.
Is the soul immortal? Like, do we just keep going after this whole life thing? We've got some really interesting sources today, including arguments from, like, the OG philosopher himself, Socrates.
Yeah, and we'll be kind of looking at those through the lens of Plato's writings, especially his dialogue, Phaedo.
Okay.
And then we'll be jumping ahead a little bit to see how, like, René Descartes tackled the same question, like, centuries later.
Cool. Oh, and to make sure you don't just take their word for it, we've also pulled in some resources on, like, how to evaluate arguments. So by the end of this, you'll be able to spot a shaky argument like a mile away.
Absolutely. So let's start in ancient Greece.
Okay.
With Socrates. Picture this.
Yeah.
You're about to have a philosophical chat with the guy right before he drinks hemlock. Mm-hmm. Talk about pressure.
Yeah, Socrates was surprisingly chill about his impending death.
And he actually used it as a chance to explore the idea of the soul's immortality.
Wow. Okay, so one of his most famous arguments is the cycle of opposites.
Yeah.
Get this. Socrates believed that life and death are like two sides of a coin, constantly flipping back and forth. And if that's true, our souls must have existed before we were even born.
Right. He uses the example of something becoming, like, bigger, like it must have been smaller before, right? So applying that to life and death, if life comes from death, then the soul must have been around even before we were born.
Okay. That's kind of mind-blowing. But then he goes even further with the recollection argument. He asks, how do we know things like equality or, like, perfect justice when we've never actually experienced them perfectly in the real world?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, Socrates argues that we're not learning these concepts, we're recollecting them from a time before we were born, when our souls existed in a world of perfect, unchanging forms.
So, like, our souls have this secret knowledge bank from a past life or something. Yeah. That's wild. Okay, but hold on, there's more. Socrates has another argument up his sleeve, the affinity argument. He says that the soul is invisible and unchanging, just like those perfect eternal forms he keeps talking about.
Things like beauty and justice and truth, they exist beyond the physical world.
So if the soul is like these immortal forms, it stands to reason that the soul itself might be immortal too.
That's the gist of it. Yeah.
Right.
It's a pretty compelling idea that the soul is drawn to these entire realms because it shares their nature.
Yeah, I can see how that would be appealing.
Right.
But here's where I get a little tripped up. If the soul never dies, if it's truly immortal, what's the opposite of immortal? How does that whole opposites thing even work? Socrates doesn't really give us an answer for that.
That's a great question, and it highlights a really important point. Like, just because an argument sounds cool doesn't mean it's flawless, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we need to know how to evaluate arguments for ourselves.
All right, so how do we do that?
So our Teach Philosophy YouTube video, it gives us some really handy tools. It talks about two main types of arguments, deductive and inductive.
Okay.
Deductive arguments, they're like logic puzzles. If the starting pieces are true, the ending has to be true too. Like, no way around it.
Like, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal, boom, nailed it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Inductive arguments, they're a bit different. They deal with probability. So if the starting pieces are true, the conclusion is probably true, but not guaranteed.
Okay, so let's apply this to Socrates. Take his cycle of opposites argument. Is it really true that everything comes from its opposite?
Yeah.
Does a banana come from not being a banana?
That's one way to think about it. And even if we accept the whole opposites idea, there's still more questions.
Right.
Does the same soul keep cycling through life and death, or are brand new souls created each time?
Yeah.
Socrates leaves a lot unanswered there.
And plus, our source from New Lane University points out that Socrates might be using a little word trickery. They compare his argument to saying, I went to the bank, a financial institution, and the bank of a river, so you need a swimsuit to get money.
Right.
He's using the same word in different ways to try to convince us.
Yeah, that's a classic example of what philosophers call the fallacy of equivocation, basically.
Oh, okay.
It's a red flag that we need to examine the argument more closely.
So Socrates' arguments, I mean, they're definitely thought-provoking.
Yeah.
But maybe not as rock-solid as they first appear.
Right.
But that doesn't mean he wasn't onto something.
Absolutely.
Let's see what another great thinker, René Descartes, had to say about the soul. This guy was famous for doubting everything.
And that's where his famous Cogito argument comes in, which is explained really well in the Philosopher Games YouTube video. Descartes doubts everything he can, the world, his senses, even math.
Wait, doubting math? That's next-level skepticism?
Right. But here's the key. Descartes realizes that he can't doubt that he's doubting. Doubting is a form of thinking, and if he's thinking, he must exist. That's where the famous line comes from. I think, therefore I am.
Okay, I see where he's going with that. So even if everything else is an illusion, the fact that I'm thinking proves something exists.
Right.
And that something, for Descartes, is the soul. Just like Socrates, he believed it was separate from the body.
Yeah.
But is that enough to prove it's immortal?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
Maybe the soul exists as this thinking thing, but it still fades away when we die.
Yeah.
The Philosopher Games video actually proposes a really interesting challenge to Descartes, calling it the logical uncertainty principle.
Ooh, what's that all about?
Well, it basically argues that we can't be completely certain about anything, even our own existence.
Whoa.
So if we can't be 100% sure we exist now, how can we be sure our souls will exist after death?
All right, now my brain is officially doing backflips. We've got Socrates with his mind-bending arguments about opposites and recollection.
Right.
And then Descartes jumps in with his radical doubt and the idea that thinking proves we exist.
Mm-hmm.
Both make compelling points.
Absolutely.
But with some holes, too. What do you think about all this so far?
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around, huh?
It is.
Both Socrates and Descartes were brilliant thinkers, but even they didn't have all the answers.
Right.
And that's okay. Philosophy isn't about finding like definitive solutions.
Right.
It's about asking the right questions and exploring like all these different perspectives.
So are you saying we should just throw up our hands and say, well, who knows?
Not at all.
Yeah.
There's still so much we can learn from examining these arguments, even if we don't, end up like totally agreeing with them. And remember, even back in Socrates' day, not everyone was convinced by his ideas.
That's true. In the Phaedo, there are some pretty smart folks who actually push back against Socrates' arguments for the soul's immortality.
Right. For example, remember Socrates' cycle of opposites argument, where he says life comes from death and vice versa? Well, one of the objections is that he might be playing a little loose with the concept of opposites.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The New Lane University video uses a really helpful analogy to explain this. They say it's like saying, I went to the bank, a financial institution, and the bank of a river, so you need a swimsuit to get money.
Right.
Just because you can use the same word in different contexts, it doesn't mean they actually mean the same thing.
Exactly. It's a fallacy of equivocation. Basically, using the same word to mean different things.
Right.
And the video suggests that Socrates might be making a similar mistake when he talks about opposites. Maybe some things do come from their opposites, but does that really apply to life and death?
Plus, even if we accept that life comes from death, there's another question that Socrates doesn't fully address.
Right.
Is it the same soul being reborn each time? Or are brand new souls created?
Yeah, it makes you wonder, what would it even mean for our sense of self if our soul kept getting recycled into different bodies throughout time?
Right. Would it still be me in some fundamental way? That gets into some really deep philosophical territory.
Totally.
And it's not just the cycle of opposites argument that gets challenged in the Phaedo. One of Socrates' buddies, Simmias, he throws a wrench into the affinity argument, too.
Yeah, remember Socrates said that the soul is immortal because it's like those eternal forms, invisible and unchanging?
Yeah.
Well, Simmias comes up with this analogy to kind of poke holes in that.
Okay.
He compares the soul to the tuning of a musical instrument.
Okay, I'm listening.
So the tuning, it's invisible and beautiful just like the soul, but it depends on the physical instrument to exist. If the instrument breaks, the tuning vanishes, even though the pieces are still there.
So Simmias is saying the soul might be like that, too. It might be this amazing intangible thing, but it still needs the body to exist.
Right.
When the body dies, the soul goes with it. Kind of bummer, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge to Socrates' idea. But Socrates fires back. He argues that the soul is different from a tuning because it can actually, control the body.
Okay.
It can make choices, resist impulses, and strive for good.
So it's not just a passive harmony. It has, agency and a will of its own.
Exactly.
But there's another objection waiting in the wings, right?
Yep. Another friend, Sabes, he raises the possibility that even if the soul is stronger and longer lasting than the body, it could still wear out and die eventually.
Okay.
He compares it to, a weaver who outlives many coats he's made but eventually dies himself. Could the soul, even if it survives one body, eventually just fade away after like multiple rebirths.
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Hmm.
How does Socrates respond to that?
He invokes the idea that some things have certain properties that are just, part of their very essence. Like the number 3, it's inherently odd. It
Right.
can't be even no matter what. Socrates thinks the soul's like that. Its very nature is to be alive.
So it can't be dead because that would contradict its essential nature.
Right.
I see what he's doing there.
Yeah.
But even with that argument, there's still room for doubt, right?
Exactly. And the source titled Platonic Arguments for the Immortality of the Soul. It points out one potential issue, that the soul might cease to exist without actually becoming dead.
Okay, that's a bit of a head-scratcher. What does that even mean?
Well, think of it like a flame. A flame doesn't have an opposite. It doesn't become undead. It simply ceases to be. Maybe the soul is similar. It doesn't die,
Yeah.
but it just stops existing at some point.
So even Socrates, with all of his brilliant arguments, can't totally prove that the soul is immortal.
Right.
That doesn't mean the whole conversation was a waste of time, though, right?
Not at all. As our pasted text source points out,
Yeah.
the real value here isn't about finding like a perfect airtight proof.
Right.
It's about engaging with these ideas, weighing the evidence, and forming your own conclusions.
It's like a mental workout for your soul.
Exactly. Plus, these arguments have major implications for how we see ourselves and the world around us. If the soul is immortal, how does that change our view of life and death? How we treat our bodies, the choices we make?
Whoa, those are some big questions. It seems like this one debate about the soul opens up a whole universe of other things to think about. It really does. Okay, so we've wrestled with these big ideas from Socrates and Descartes, but I'm still wondering, why does this whole soul question even matter today? It can't just be like an ancient brain teaser, right?
Oh, you're right. It goes way deeper than that. The Professor O.H. at Vassar video brings up this fascinating point from the Phaedo. Socrates believed that our souls are constantly searching for truth, those eternal forms that we talked about. And get this, for those who truly love wisdom, Socrates thought death might actually be a kind of liberation.
Wait, I'm confused. Is Socrates actually saying death is something to look forward to?
Well, think about it this way. What if the body is actually weighing the soul down, like distracting it with earthly desires and limitations? Death, as that separation of soul from body, could be seen as a way to finally access those pure eternal truths.
So it's like death is a doorway to a higher level of understanding.
Right.
That's a pretty radical way to think about things.
It definitely challenges the way we usually think about life and death. And it raises a really big question for us. If caring for the soul is the most important thing we can do, even more important than our physical well-being, how should we be living?
So does that mean we should all become hermits, meditating on mountaintops and ignoring all earthly pleasures?
Not necessarily. Remember, Socrates was super engaged with the world.
Right.
He was always questioning, challenging assumptions, searching for truth in every conversation.
He was kind of a philosophical rock star, always pushing people to think deeper.
Exactly. So caring for your soul might not mean withdrawing from the world.
Right.
It could mean engaging with it more thoughtfully, seeking knowledge, appreciating beauty, and just living in a way that aligns with your deepest values.
Yeah, and that brings us back to something we touched on earlier from the pasted text source. It's not about blindly accepting someone else's argument about the soul. It's about understanding the arguments, thinking critically about them, and then forming your own conclusions.
Right. You become an active participant in the conversation, not just someone passively absorbing information.
Right.
And that's a skill that applies to way more than just this soul question. It's about learning how to think for yourself in all areas of life.
You're telling me suddenly all those clickbait headlines and questionable claims online don't stand a chance.
That's the idea. And that's exactly what we hope you've gained from this deep dive. The tools to not only understand these arguments, but to analyze them, challenge them, and ultimately decide what you believe.
So after all this, is the soul immortal? Honestly, we've explored some of the brightest minds and most compelling arguments in history, but the answer remains a mystery.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Even if we can't definitively, prove or disprove the soul's immortality, just asking the question forces us to confront some of our deepest values and beliefs.
It makes you think about what truly matters, how you want to live, and what you believe happens after this whole life thing is over.
And that in itself is a profoundly valuable journey.
Absolutely. So as you head back out into the world, armed with your newfound philosophical superpowers, remember to keep asking questions, keep searching for truth, and maybe, just maybe, keep an open mind about what might lie beyond this life.
And we'll leave you with this final thought from Professor O.H. at Vassar. What do you think? Is the soul's well-being the most important thing? And if so, how does that shape your understanding of happiness, purpose, and the choices you make each day?
This deep dive has given you the knowledge. Now it's up to you to decide.